It feels a little bit like a therapy group, some sort of group therapy, 30 years of post-trauma since Oslo, so we're here to share our experiences and the difficult times we have all experienced. The problem is that it's not really a retrospective conference, it's one of current affairs, because we are still living in the reality that Oslo had dictated 30 years ago. Oslo remains the DNA of the national discourse in Israel on strategic issues, from the Palestinian issue to religion and state to nuclear Iran. And I think that we must understand that each of us has encountered the Oslo process somewhere else. Everyone sitting in this room, everyone participating in the discussions. I encountered Oslo as part of my military service. I had spent some time in the military legal branch. I was part of a team writing a book on the legal way that the IDF encountered the Palestinians. And by the way, I'm not an attorney. I did not finish law school, and my book was published in 1993 in English, Oslo in the Intifada, and it talked about the use of international law when it comes to addressing the Palestinian issue. I then was moved to the Kogat, and afterwards the Kogat, then Danny Rothschild, was appointed head of the negotiations team from the Israeli side with the PLO on civil affairs, and so I was brought there to head the Bureau of Negotiations, and so I was a major at the time, a captain at the time, and I was in part of negotiations with PLO, and we traveled a lot to Cairo, etc. So I wanted to focus my talk here today on how I saw the IDF's effect on the general staff, and in the years that followed, working in the Prime Minister's office and then as an investigator and journalist, I saw the effect on the IDF in the long term, on the IDF and also on Israeli foreign relations, if I have time left at the end. So first of all, we must understand, and most of you do, but still, for the record, this entire perception of Oslo is founded on two basic assumptions. The first basic assumption is that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a result of the occupation, of Israeli control in certain areas that we have taken over in 1967 and are not ours. That's occupation. And in order to limit or to resolve this conflict, Israel must withdraw. And the meaning of that is that Israel is to blame, that justice is on the other side. There is a conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis because the Israelis, the Jews, are in an area that does not belong to them. That is the first basic assumption of Oslo. That's actually the basic assumption of Land for Peace, and that's definitely the underlying assumption of Oslo. And the second underlying assumption of Oslo is that the PLO turned its back to terror and is now a legitimate partner. And so that Yasser Arafat is no longer a terrorist, he is a partner for peace. And without him, we can do nothing. The PLO is the only representative of the Palestinian people. Now, we heard this week, as the minutes of the discussions in the government were unveiled about the declaration of principles, that Rabin realized this was a gamble. He thought that it's reversible. That, okay, if it won't work, we'll be able to simply go back on it and cancel the whole thing. And it really was his gamble. Now I'm going to try, and if it won't work, okay, we'll go back on it. Now what we saw with Rabin, and this was also expressed in his conduct throughout this period of time, and I had the honor of working alongside him and his people, Rabin really did not want a Palestinian state. We saw that Gershon Cohen kept talking about his last speech in the Knesset, his last address, but he was actually pulled into this process. Once you take a gamble and you're a politician and it's a democracy, it is very difficult afterwards to then exit this dynamics, because even if you realize this was a big lie, this was fraud, you can't go back on it, because when you come out of it, you come out looking petty, you come out looking like a loser. And he thought it was reversible, but it wasn't really once he was into it. And Rabin realized that Peres couldn't be trusted, that Peres's people, that he sent them behind his back to negotiate with a terrorist and to sabotage the talks in Washington. And so when he returned from Washington after signing, he realized that the only way to solve this is to take over the process. And how to take over the process is to send IDF officials, and because he was the Minister of Defense, they were subordinate to him. And so he moved all the negotiations from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and of course people outside to the IDF. Amnon Lipkin-Shachak, who was Deputy Chief of General Staff, was appointed as head of Kogat and also head of the planning division later on, and he was head of the talks from the military side, and he thought that would solve some of the problem. But what it did was that it brought the IDF into this gamble too, because the IDF, again, it turned the IDF into something controversial. Here is a process that is controversial, where half the people realize that it is fraud, and you're bringing the IDF into it. It's not like Camp David, where it's territories right there, over there somewhere. These are territories that are part of Israel. And remember that Barak, as Chief of General Staff, said this has more holes than Swiss cheese, but then suddenly the IDF was in there, just like Rabin. It was sucked in. And we as officers kept hearing a statement that was used then, that we need to change point of view, our mindset. And I understand that Effie talked about it this morning. What does it mean? It means that we shouldn't recognize reality, we shouldn't acknowledge reality. And I'll give you some anecdotes, because that kind of gives us the feel of things. So the first anecdote is about a fellow of ours on the Palestinian side, Muhammad Dakhlan. Dakhlan was the head of the negotiations team on security affairs. He sat with Uzi Dayan, who was head of planning, and he was very charismatic, and he was very good looking. He had this haircut, he had these designer suits, Pierre Cardin with his cigarettes and so on. He spoke Hebrew. He spoke Hebrew from the street. Not from the street, because he was in Beersheba prison, because in the 1980s, Dakhlan was the head of the Tanzim, or the Shabab in Gaza during the first Intifada. He organized all the Fatah youth together with his friend, a person who was also with him, called Muhammad Def, who also was a prisoner in Beersheba prison with him. Now, while he was negotiating with us, he was also negotiating at the same time with Def. That's another anecdote. One day we're in Cairo, and the guys from our delegation knock on Dakhlan's door. I was at the office, and after about 20 minutes they come up to us with very surprised looks on their faces. Well, what's going on? I asked them, and they said, look, he sat there on his own and he was praying with the carpet and everything, and they were shocked. He's a guy, he has women in Netanya, he goes and he has women in Netanya, and now he's praying all of a sudden. And they didn't understand. At the same time, he was the PLO, because they're secular, they don't understand what faith is. So they sent him, Arafat sent him to negotiate with his friend Def about what Fatah can discuss and what Hamas is in charge of. And of course this is no written agreement, but it was obvious that Hamas would carry out terrorist attacks only in areas that are outside the area of the PA, meaning not Jericho and Gaza. So almost immediately we had Nachshon Waxman, who was abducted from the Tel HaShomer army base and then was taken to Bir Nabala near Ramallah, which was under our control. So we knew this, but we ignored it. We ignored it because what is the meaning of it? The meaning is that there is no agreement, that this is a scam, that we must not proceed, that these people are our enemies, that we cannot negotiate with them anymore, that that's it, the story is over. But we couldn't do that. So for a time, I think in 1995, I kept getting reports every couple of weeks from the civil administration in the West Bank about violations of the Palestinians in the civil side, and so I was the coordinator, so I had to put them all together, and I kept issuing reports about violations of the agreement. Now these violations, everyone talks about incitement, and it's true, but these violations were in every area. There was not a single agreement signed with the Palestinians where they were supposed to give us something and deliver, and they actually delivered. They breached and violated everything from insurance on accidents and planning and construction and the electromagnetic spectrum where they took IDF frequencies, everything. From Gaza on the one hand, the West Bank on the other, I take these things, I put them in an envelope where I explain the processes, what happens, what that actually means about the Palestinian Authority. And so approximately once a month I would issue my reports and I would disseminate them to the relevant people, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Head of Mossad, Head of ISA, Chief of General Staff, Deputy Chief of General Staff, and they were enraged, they were angry at me. I did something that I thought was obvious, and people started to respond with rage. Why are you giving this to us? What good does it do to us? What's the difference? What are you trying to say? Why does it matter? Nothing. What am I trying to do? I'm just conveying information that I thought would be relevant. So what happened? What happened was that once you go into it, you're there. And once you're there, we thought at first, or Rabin probably thought at first, that it's reversible. And if reality would lead us to the opposite conclusion than the one that had led us to the Oslo Accords, then we would go with reality. But we saw that this reality was crying out to us from every direction, from the get-go. But the policy, on the other hand, just went with the process instead of with reality. So there was this kind of a crossroads, and they decided to go with the process rather than go with the reality. And now, 30 years later, what do we see? Well, I will just give you one final story, which you know because it just happened. We all saw it from the outside together, and that is the story of the last operation of the IDF in Jenin. Now, there was a report issued earlier in July about the Palestinian media that said that the Palestinian media outlets and the Fatah internet website are saying that 2/3 of the terror coming out of Jenin is carried out by members of the PA, the security apparatuses, and Fatah members. And maybe it's true, maybe it isn't, maybe there are dual affiliations, that's often the case. But the fact that they were boasting it, that they were the ones responsible, the security apparatuses and the Fatah are responsible for 2/3 of the terror attacks, and the purpose of the operation was what? To clean Jenin refugee camp and to give the control over it from the PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, to the security apparatuses. So what does that mean? And here we return to the paradigms, to the basic assumptions underlying the Oslo Accords, because the basic assumption that says that we are responsible for the dispute, for the conflict, and the other assumption that says that the PLO has turned its back on terror and is now a partner on the other, both of them lead to several operative conclusions and to the guidelines for the IDF on the ground. The first conclusion is that you cannot limit or impede or harm the other side because they're a partner. So it doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter that Caroline Glick sent violation reports back in 1995. It doesn't matter what's happening now in practice. Nothing changes anything, because if this paradigm remains true, if this underlying basic assumption about the PLO having turned its back to terror remains valid, then when you go on this operation, the purpose of this operation is to strengthen it, not to diminish it. And the last thing I want to say is the spirit. The spirit, if you do not believe that what you're doing is right, and we remember Barak's statement that if he were a Palestinian, he too would be a terrorist. Dear God, what did you just say? Who are you representing? They are murderers. They are murdering us everywhere. And you're saying that if you were a Palestinian, you too would murder? What does that mean? How can you head forces on the ground? What kind of spirit do you instill in the forces under you? What kind of spirit do you instill in your people's army? If you think that the other side is right, and you know that the other side is violating every agreement, how can you head the IDF? How can you head an operation and lead the forces? And if I were to end this ventilation session of group therapy, as I did in my book in 2015 about this subject, I will say that the solution for this spiritual failure is to elevate the spirit. If we want to once and for all come out of this nightmare, we need once and for all to set aside these false basic assumptions and to reconnect to the truth of our Jewish Zionist story. Because if we will not be able to do that, then God forbid, I will be invited in 10 years' time to speak about the lessons learned of 40 years late after Oslo and 50 years after Oslo, and I don't want to come. I want to come in 10 years' time and talk about a decade of renewing Zionism in Israeli society in these essential institutions, and like the IDF and the Foreign Ministry. So thank you very much.